Continuing this conference. So next up, for you psychology fans, we have Eisha Haroon presenting Judging Facial Expressions of Emotion.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. First of all, thank you, Jessie, for that introduction. So today I'll be discussing my work at the Social Cognitive Science Lab. In particular, I'll be sharing with you today my work as an individual project student for the Psych 406 course. And I'll be sharing with you my project on judging facial expressions of emotion, in particular, how we judge ambiguous facial expressions of emotion. So, just a little outline of my talk. I'm going to start with some theoretical background behind the study, how we designed and our method for the study. And then I will move on to a sort of deep dive into the behavioral analysis and discuss those results, ending with some implications of our research and the future of our findings and future research directions. All right, so a little bit of background. First of all, facial expressions are essential to social life. We all know this. Understanding and producing facial expressions successfully as a way of conveying our internal states is a crucial part of our daily lives and social interactions. Our facial expressions are essential as a way of conveying our internal states, and they can often change the tone of our conversations. Our ability to understand and pick up on another person's internal states based on their distinct facial expressions and the cues of their emotions based on their face is also a key part to a lot of social processes such as empathy. And perceiving and judging these facial expressions of emotions are it's a rapid and fine-tuned process. Even something as simple as a smile can convey so much information, such as affiliation or dominance. When we try to perceive or judge facial expressions of emotion, research has shown that people tend to rely on the upper half or lower half of the face, in particular, the eyes and mouth. So the weight of importance on the upper half or lower half of the face changes based on whether you're making judgments about a specific type of emotion or emotion expression. So for instance, when you're judging whether a face is happy or disgusted, people tend to rely on the lower half of the face, in particular the mouth. Whereas when you're trying to discern whether a face is angry, sad, or fearful, people tend to rely on the upper half of the face, areas such as the eyes and eyebrows. And this is in line with the facial muscles or facial action units and areas associated with those basic emotions. For instance, when I smile, my mouth muscles move, and that is the region where the most movement occurs, the most muscles are activated, and that is the region where perceivers tend to focus their gaze when making judgments about whether I am happy or not. Now, we also tend to rely on our emotion categories and labels. So how do we describe or categorize our emotions? And this can influence our perception. So for instance, just including words, emotion words in particular, such as angry or happy, can shift a person's judgment of a face. For instance, if I were to show you a typically angry face, but only provide you with the option of labeling it as disgusted or not, you may be pushed towards judging the angry face as disgusted. So this shows that our goal of categorization and how we categorize facial expressions and the labels and context we have available for those emotions can influence our perception. And in the study, essentially, we wanted to investigate how people perceive and categorize ambiguous facial expressions. So in specific, our research question was, how do individuals view and judge facial expressions of emotion as a function of their goals for emotion perception and features of ambiguous expressions? So our study followed by a 4x16 within subjects design. We recruited 80 participants from the Rotman participant pool, and they were asked to come in and participate in our eye tracking study. They were shown 16 possible combinations of stimuli. So we took stimuli from the Radboud face database. We horizontally split them, so they were split into upper half and lower half, and they were recombined. So we took angry faces, happy faces, fearful faces, and surprised faces, and they were recombined to create 16 possible combinations of stimuli. And participants were asked to make binary ratings. So they would have been shown a set of faces, and they would have been asked whilst viewing those set of faces, is this face angry or not? Then in the next block, they could have been asked, is this face happy or not? And then in the next blocks, they could have been asked, is this face surprised or not? And then they might have been asked, is this face fearful or not? So they had to respond with yes or no. We also looked at their eye gaze during the experiment, as well as the reaction time. How quickly did they respond to the stimuli? As well as where did they focus their gaze when making their judgments? Now, just to give you an example of what our stimuli looked like. So on the left, you see a characteristic happy face, fully happy, both happy eyes and happy smile. And then on the right, I'll just show you what a horizontally recombined incongruent face would look like. So as you can see, again, we're still seeing that smile, but if you are curious to know what the upper half of the face is, I would recommend that you either cover the lower half of the face and see if you can make a judgment about what that face is supposed to be, what the lower half of what the upper half of the face was recombined with. So if you could pay attention to the eyebrows, you can see that the upper half of the face is angry. So in this case, we recombined an angry upper face with a lower happy face. So that's what one of the stimuli could have looked like. And so for the purposes of this talk, I will be focusing on the behavioral analysis of our results. So essentially, how did people judge the stimuli and the relative importance of the upper half versus the lower half of the face when they made the emotion judgments? So I'm going to start off with when participants were asked to rate whether a face was angry or not. So on the graph on the left, you'll see that the red bar indicates a fully angry face. So when participants viewed a fully angry face, more often than not, people were consistently and correctly judging this face as angry. However, when we then keep the lower half of the face constant, so we're going to keep that angry lower face and swap out the eyes, so we could add in fearful, surprised, or happy eyes. Participants tend to rate those faces as being not angry. So more often than not, when seeing those recombined faces, participants do not rate them as happy or judge them as happy. However, when we swap out which part of the face we keep constant, we see a huge change in ratings. So now we're keeping the upper half of the face constant and changing out the lower face. So we've got continuous angry eyes and adding in either a fearful lower face, happy lower face, or surprised lower face. So when adding a fearful or surprised lower face, participants are judging those recombined faces, so the angry upper eyes with fearful or surprised lower face, as being angry more often than not. There does not seem to be a huge difference in how people judge recombined happy and angry faces. They're being consistently rated as not angry more often. Okay, so what does this all mean? So just to give you another graph, we start off with 0% face anger, which is essentially 100% happy face, 100% fearful face, and 100% surprised face. And then we're just adding in angry eyes. So as we can see, that addition of angry eyes to both fearful and surprised faces makes a huge difference in participant judgments, which indicates that the upper half of the face for angry eyes is super important. Automatically, we're seeing this huge jump, and it's likely that the angry eyes are conveying more negative valence, which is also why we're seeing both surprised and fearful faces are jumping up in their ratings as being angry. Furthermore, this is in line with previous research, as it shows that people do rely on the eyes and need the angry eyes cue and eyebrows cue to make accurate judgments of anger or judgments of anger. As we mentioned before, we also see this is important of action units. When we make a scowled sort of angry face, we tend to move our eyebrows and eyes more than we do the lower half of the face. There also seems to be a sort of weird tension between the angry eyes with the happy smile, where the addition of angry eyes is still pushing up the percentage of times that people are rating a combined happy and angry face as angry, but it's still most consistently participants are saying, no, that face is not angry. And it's likely that that happy smile is weighing down those judgments. It is also possible that the goal of having to rate faces as angry or not is affecting people's judgments. So when they were shown these faces, they were asked, is this face angry or not? And just that context or presence of is this face angry, adding that word could have affected people's judgments and pushed those judgments towards angry. Now, moving on. I'm going to talk about how people judged faces that were either rated to be happy or not. So on the graph on the left, you'll see 100% happy faces, the green bar, Everyone considers them to be happy most consistently. It is, in fact, the emotion that people view as happy most accurately and most consistently of the time. And when we swap out the lower half of the face, so we lose the smile and just keep the happy eyes, and then we add in an angry, fearful, or surprised lower face, people do not consider those recombined ambiguous expressions as being happy. However, when we instead keep the lower half of the face constant and swap out the eyes, we're seeing a huge change in behavior, where surprised combined happy faces are now being rated as happy, as well as fearful faces. Angry faces remains about the same. So what does this all mean? Well, as you can see, adding a smile can push these ratings way up. When we add a smile to a surprised and fearful face, most of the time then participants will say, oh no, that ambiguous facial expression is happy. And just that addition of a smile can even outweigh negative faces, negative valence, like in the case of fearful faces. A fearful face often connotes a negative valence of fear, the fear emotion. However, adding that smile is sort of outweighing or pushing away that negative valence, where people are rating that combined fearful, happy face as happy. Interestingly enough, we do see a difference between surprised eyes and fear eyes, where it's quite possible that fear eyes are still conveying some form of negative valence, or surprised eyes are just not, which is despite the facial similarity between the two, the characteristic widened eyes, which is why surprised happy faces are far more likely to be considered rated as happy, whereas fearful happy faces still above chance, but much lower than the surprised happy combination. This also adds to our understanding of face masks and emotion perception, where the smile is the most important cue. This is in line with most previous research. And it also highlights that when the smile is not present, people tend to struggle with determining whether the face is happy or not, or tend to rate it as not happy more often than not. All right, so now I'm just going to discuss fear and surprise. So this is rating fear. So essentially the participants were asked, is this face fearful or not? So the blue bar is 100% fearful. And we can see that more often than not, participants correctly judge the faces as being fearful. When we swap out the upper face and keep the lower, when we swap out the lower face and keep the upper face constant, so we've got fearful eyes, swapping out the lower face, we add in a surprised face, for instance. People are then rating that recombined face as fearful more often than not, above the 50% line. When we swap in an angry or happy face, people tend to rate those faces as not fearful. However, now we're going to keep the upper half of, we're going to swap the upper half of the face and keep the lower face constant. So fearful lower face, changing the eyes. Adding in surprised eyes, again, it's kind of sitting around that 50%, just over that 50% line, where more often than not, just slightly more often than not, people are rating that combined fearful, surprised faces as being fearful. And again, not a huge difference for angry and happy faces. It's quite possible that just losing the smile is what's pushing the happy faces up slightly. And now I'm just going to discuss surprise due to the conceptual similarity of fear and surprise. So now we have a surprised, 100% surprised face being rated as surprised 100% of the time, or close to most of the time. And then so now we're just going to keep the upper half of the face constant and swap out the lower face. So again, surprised, widen eyes, change the lower face. When we add in an angry lower face or a happy lower face, people do not judge the expression as being surprised. Even when we add in a fearful lower face, people do not tend to judge that ambiguous expression as surprised. However, when we swap which part of the face we keep constant, we see a huge change in behavior again, where now we're keeping the lower half of the face constant and changing the upper half of the face. Now, so 100% surprised, again, people are rating that as surprised most consistently. And now when we have a combined surprised fearful face, where we have a fearful upper face, so widened eyes, surprised lower face, again, there's a huge jump in how people will judge those expressions, and they are being considered surprised way more often than not. And when something similar is happening with angry faces, where we're adding in angry eyes and keeping a surprised lower face, we're seeing that around 50% of the time, people are judging that ambiguous recombined facial expression as being surprised. So just to give you an example of what these fearful and surprised faces might look like, this is a great time, again, if you want to cover one half of the face and see if you can judge which part of the face is which emotion. They are recombined. So on the left, on the left, you'll see a recombined face where the upper half is fear and the lower half is surprised. And on the right, you can see that the upper half is now surprised and the lower half is fear. Now let's look at what happens if we just add in a surprised lower face. So we start off with 0% face surprise, which is 100% fearful, 100% angry, and 100% happy. Now I'm just going to focus on the combined fearful and surprised faces. Now, fear and surprised expressions are often mistaken for each other, and our results are in line with that previous research, where you can see a 100% fearful face is judged as surprised slightly over 50% of the time, or over 50% of the time. Now, this is likely just due to the facial similarity between the two expressions. We're seeing there's the cue of the raised eyebrows, the widened eyes. And now when we add a surprised lower face, we're seeing a huge jump, as well as people are far more likely to rate a combined fearful surprised face as surprised. So it's likely the fact that there's a lack of now that downturned fearful lower half that was weighing down the ratings in the beginning. Now that we've added in that surprised mouth, people are far more likely to rate that ambiguous combined face as surprised. There's also some conceptual similarity between the subjective experiences associated with both fear and surprise. Sort of the events in which one would either feel fear or surprise are often quite similar, and both fear and surprise also sit close to each other in terms of valence and arousal on the circumplex model. So in terms of valence, surprise is non-negative, where fear is. However, in terms of arousal, they're quite similar. Again, this may have to do with just the label of surprise being available, and it is the participant's goal to judge stimuli as either surprised or not. So having that goal of is this face surprised or not could be influencing people's perceptions and pushing people to rate those ambiguous, fearful, and surprised faces as surprised more often. So what does this all mean? In line with current research about the importance of the upper region of the face and versus the lower half of the face, our research distinguishes that yes, the eyes and the upper half of the face is very important in providing a cue when people make judgments about whether a face is angry or fearful or surprised to an extent. And it also, again, highlights that yes, the mouth is important and the lower half of the face is important when making judgments about whether a face is happy or not. There does seem to be, again, a clarification that the mouth is also important for surprised faces, which was found in a couple of studies where people do depend on both the mouth and the eyes when making a judgment about whether a face is surprised or not. And it's quite possible that when we're distinguishing between whether a face is fearful or surprised, that might depend on the shape of the mouth. So fearful faces tend to have a slightly more downturned mouth, whereas surprised faces may lack that distinguishing characteristic. This is also in line with our current understanding of facial action units and the regions associated with producing those facial expressions. For instance, let's look at fear and surprise. Given the characteristic physical similarity of widened eyes and both fearful and surprised faces, we're seeing that they are often confused for each other, and that might be what people are looking for when making judgments about fear and surprised faces. We're also seeing that happy faces, which is characteristic of our lovely smile, and the muscles associated with making a smile all are concentrated towards the lower half of the face, and people need that cue when making judgments about whether a face is happy or not. Our research also highlights the importance of emotion categories, language, and our goals for categorizing emotions and facial expressions. So the goal of having to categorize a stimuli as either surprised or not, or happy or not, could sway judgments for ambiguous facial expressions. As we saw with surprised and fear faces, asking a participant if this fearful face is surprised may be swaying their perception and judgment of those expressions. Same thing goes for combined angry and surprised faces. So future directions, we're going to look into the reaction time analyses and see how participants' reaction times change based on whether the stimuli they are judging are congruent, meaning they're 100% one expression, or incongruent and recombined, so whether the face has like angry eyes and happy smile, for instance, and whether their reaction time differs and changes based on that factor, as well as whether the emotion is congruent with their goal. So for instance, do people take longer to judge whether a face is surprised or not when they're seeing a fully fearful face? We'll also be analyzing the eye gaze of our participants. Where do their eyes focus when based on the goal? Where do their eyes focus when making judgments about whether a face is happy or not versus angry or not? And then we'll be looking into some drift diffusion modeling of decision-making behavior. So how does our evidence accumulation and drift rate change based on the emotion being judged and rated? And another thing I would like to do is see what happens if we give different emotion labels to the participants. So instead of asking them, oh, is this face fearful or not, what would happen if we asked them, is this face fearful or surprised? It doesn't have to be necessarily binary either. You could see what happens if they are given a scale, for instance. So what percentage of this face is, to what extent is this face fearful versus surprised? So thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm looking forward to answering any questions that people might have.
All right. Thank you for that lovely presentation. We've got a few questions from the audience. Just for some clarification questions, someone asked if you could break down your research question a little bit more simply.
Yeah, so essentially we were looking at two things. A, how do people perceive ambiguous facial expressions as a function of the characteristic physicality of those expressions? And the second part is how do people's perception and judgment of facial expressions change based on their goals? So if I were to ask you, is this face surprised or not, your goal would be to categorize whether an emotion is surprised or a facial expression of emotion is surprised or not. However, if I changed your goal, is this face angry or not, I want to see how your perception and judgment of an ambiguous face changes based on that goal. I hope that answers your question.
Someone has a sort of concern, I guess, about your study in which they want to ask whether the pictures that were taken of the Confederates were they were acted or if they were genuine. And if you think whether or not they were genuine or not can sort of affect how the participants perceived everything.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a concern. As you know, most emotion perception research, when we ask people to make a face and then take a photo of it, it's often acted, which is why when we do research, we tend to use different databases. We try to use a variety of databases when we follow up. And often the thing is that when we have facial expressions of emotion, we often have a stereotype of a particular facial expression of emotion. So if I were to ask you to imagine a fearful face, it's quite likely that you will have a stereotypical expression in your mind, or a characterized version, sort of a caricature of what a fearful expression might look like, which is why we wanted to see what would happen if we were to swap out sort of and change the upper half or the lower half of the face and make them slightly more ambiguous.
Okay, so one last question since we are coming up on the next one. Someone asked, the facial expression of our mouth area is often affected by the muscles on our cheeks. Do you think extending the lower face to cover the cheeks will be more representative of how we interpret the lower face?
Now, that's a really interesting question because recently there's been a lot of literature about face masks. And as you know, face masks tend to cover way past our cheeks. If you wear glasses like I do, you tend to put the face mask a little bit underneath your glasses just to prevent fog. So it's quite interesting that how our emotion perception changes when we see someone in a mask. For instance, when we cover up all the way to the eye area, and those faces are often perceived as less happy, even though they are smiling underneath those masks.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So now we're going to take a short break and we'll be back